So I want to follow up on this point that you're making, Elizabeth, and ask us to talk a little bit more about the relationship between more traditional congregational communities and newer kinds of expressions of Unitarian Universalism, because I think sometimes the conversations that I've heard have felt like those are two separate things, and here's creative, cool, innovative things over here, and here's boring congregations over here. And actually what I see is a network that's woven together in all kinds of ways in terms of where leaders are and so on. So can you talk a little bit more, let's talk a little bit more about where we see those connections happening in mutual support and relationship.
Yeah, and I mean, at Lucy Stone, we do one of the oldest things. People live there, people eat dinner together, people sing. These are ancient practices that are alive in vibrant ways in many congregations. So I do think in so many ways, it's not here's this shiny new thing. It's here's another manifestation of the ancient spiritual ways of gathering in community that we all yearn for and sustain us. And different forms serve different people. And if there are people who aren't being served by some current forms, then can we change the forms so that the practices are accessible? So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point because I have noticed that there can be tension and it can be hard. These relationships can be challenging and difficult. Like you said, at meetings with your planning team, it can be really hard, and that's why you sing together. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about relationships in a small group of people who are planning something, or relationships between Sanctuary Boston and the two different congregations where they meet, which is in First Church in Boston and First Parish in Cambridge. Those relationships haven't always been easy, and I think it's really impressive that there's this amazing worship community that meets in these two different congregations. What a show of interdependence, and again that issue of space, that congregations have space. So I think those relationships really can be a huge blessing to everyone involved, but they can be hard because it can feel challenging to figure out how we share our resources, how we align our mission, how we open up our hearts to feel like there really is an abundance and a shared mission, and not a scarcity of how are we going to get the people to our place so that we can have the people or the shiny thing or the money
inside our...
Yeah, it's hard. Everybody wants to do some of this, and that's why we have spiritual practices.
Yeah, and I think, we've also seen that sometimes those fears, we have to experience for ourselves that those fears may not come true. Mm-hmm. So at Sanctuary Boston, my sort of anecdotal assessment is that no one who worships on Wednesday evenings who also worships at the host churches on Sunday mornings has come on Sunday mornings any less. That was an awkward way of saying that, but
they didn't.
It's not a zero-sum game.
Steal their parishioners.
And people go on Sunday mornings because they get a particular thing, and they go on Wednesday evenings because they get something different, and they're not mutually exclusive. But what is true is that there are people who come both on Sunday mornings who don't come on Wednesday nights, and people who come on Wednesday nights who don't come on Sunday mornings.
There's an overlap.
So it actually, having more entry points, which I know you all have talked about before, serves more people, but it doesn't necessarily limit who you're currently serving or force people to choose.
Right.
That's right.
And I think that when I was serving in the parish, I would often think that Sunday morning, that's the big thing. And I had to start to rethink that as we started some different kinds of outreach and different ways of entering. And recently I was at a Innovations in Religious Education conference Carrie was also at, and we learned about, in Des Moines, Iowa, they've been doing some really amazing things on Wednesday nights that are feeding the souls of people in the congregation. They have a lot of their religious education, their OWL, their coming of age, they have programs for adults, they have dinner together, and they do have some people who just come on Wednesdays and some people who just come on Sundays, and then a lot of overlap. But they're able to meet people's needs in a deep and actually more accessible way for new folks especially, by having multiple points of of entry there, and not just thinking of Sunday morning as their real thing and Wednesday as something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many ways that people connect with faith communities, and I really want to hold up and appreciate the notion that like trying new things isn't easy. It's hard. Of course, trying to tread water in the reality of the changing religious life in America is also hard. And you know, we need mutual support and spiritual strength and sustenance and encouragement to find the path forward. But I've also seen congregation, like folks who are trying to lead new ministries who are deeply rooted in congregations for whom being able to try new things has actually renewed their commitment and their faith in a way that serving on the governing board of an existing institution can't quite do. And I've seen churches really reimagine different kinds of ways to interact with their community. And engage a whole different set of leaders also by trying new approaches. Like I know we had a blog post recently on the Growing UU blog about dinner church, which is pretty much what it sounds like. And there's a church in Arlington, Massachusetts that's been experimenting with this and has a couple months in has had some pretty great turnout, and that's not a huge upfront kind of investment thing, right? But it is a pretty different approach from the Sunday morning centric way of thinking about religious community that's been really engaging a lot folks from a lot of different age groups and backgrounds.
Yeah, and sometimes I think it's also just about like seeing where our gifts are and telling the story of how we're using those gifts, and then seeing what room that creates. I think about being part of a worship service that was part of an environmental justice action recently, and a number of area Unitarian Universalist religious leaders led a laying on of hands on activists who were committing to risk arrest and participate in civil disobedience. And I don't know that any of the congregations who had people there would necessarily have seen that as a place of emerging ministry or a place of outreach, but I would say it totally was. There were tons of activists there who probably maybe have never been in a UU community, who were participating in a worship service, receiving spiritual sustenance and blessing. And in terms of the resource side of things, there wasn't a particular investment, there wasn't a formal relationship that had to be made, but I think there's space to do those types of things and then tell the story of them and see where they can grow.
Yeah, and we certainly talk a lot about being able to try something and see how it goes as a way of building relationship out into the community, rather than trying to put together a really large plan over here in a corner with your committee and then feeling obligated to carry it forward for 3 years or whatever it is, even as the realities change or you learn new things or...
Yeah. I mean, I think that is really core for me, is to risk action. Like I sometimes say, we're already saved from perfection. And like Carrie said, thank goodness, right? And like Carrie said, that there are risks to not risking, though I think I'm taught to not look at, like it's easier.
The status quo is not just safe.
Right. And
it's not.
It's easier sometimes to take the risks that we're already taking that we're taught aren't risks because they're the status quo than the ones that are unknowns. But actually, I think some of our most powerful spiritual growth happens in the risking. And and I totally agree that waiting until you have a perfect plan and then trying it will usually be disappointing.
Yeah, and you're also not going to be able to have the funding up front for your perfect plan. Like that's something I think I hear a lot from folks is like, you start out this thing and maybe you have a grant, enough grant money from your funding program or somewhere to give it a go, but you don't have the long-term funding plan set up yet because you're just trying it out. And that is a really big challenge, I think, for a lot of our emerging ministries. And like people hustle and make it work. Like I know Chicago Chalice Connection, which is a group of young adults in Chicago who do a lot of really awesome justice ministry, as well as just, young adult cohort ministry, they, had some funding, and then it kind of was running out, and they did a big fundraising campaign and made it work. And I was really impressed with that because, for a little bit there, I was like, oh, what's going to happen now? But, they took the risk, they did the action, they had a network that was really exciting, and then they managed to make it work.
They had a track record, they had relationships,
Right.
and they built
they
up,
were doing the ministry, and when they ran out of the money, so then they found the money,
Well, I think that we as Unitarian Universalists have a culture that is really afraid of failure, and one just really life-giving way of thinking about this I heard from Karen Bellavance Grace, who's one of our religious professionals serving the New England region, and she talks about expera learning. She says, we can't fail when we experiment because we will always learn. And so the more we can cultivate that mentality of expera learning, learning as we go, even if something doesn't work out, we're going to learn from it, and we're going to be able to fine tune, and we're going to be able to grow from it. And we can get very anxious and scared as individuals and as congregations and want to pull back and say, oh, that failed, we got to stick with what we know, what's safe. But as Elizabeth was talking about that, it just really underscored for me that the safe in terms of the traditional congregation and what feels safe is not so safe anymore at all because of the huge sea change going on in American religion, that we're not going to keep attracting people the same way. We're not going to keep sustaining our institutions in the same way. So recognizing the lack of solidity and safety in what feels safe and solid, and giving ourselves some willingness to experiment and learn from it can set us in a good place to begin to do some emerging ministries.
Yeah, and I think, the experience of trying something and have it not go well, but still be there, be like, well, that did not go how I wanted it to, and still here.
Yeah.
I think that is a really important experience to have. And Jeremy Nickel, who serves a church that does some really neat community engagement stuff, talks about in their congregation, they say FAIL stands for first attempt in learning. And they really push themselves to have many attempts in learning. And if they're not risking failures, they're not learning.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If everything goes perfectly to plan, you are clearly not pushing the envelope far enough, right?